you doing, everybody? Happy holidays to you. It's the Wednesday before Christmas, which puts us like the 20th today, I think it is. This year's just flown by, and it's certainly come with plenty of trials and tribulations, not the least of which was my wife's slip into obscurity, disappearing, drugs, alcohol. I mean, my soul still cries for her, but it's been a long time now since she's been kind of not part of my life, and we're adapting, we're surviving, but it makes the holidays strange. Even seeing my family is like weird when you've gone to see your family every time for 10 years with your wife and her kids. Have them all kind of absent at the holidays is strange, but I do want to appeal to anybody who wishes to help out the cafe right now. These are going to be lean months coming ahead, and I want to keep this place going. Her disappearance has cost me dearly. She paid the mortgage on the building, and now the cafe has to cover that. So anybody who wants to, either through PayPal, Superfans, Super Thanks, Patreon, please help support this cafe. It's an important place for people to come and learn about jazz and talk about the social and cultural history of it. And your gifts at this time of the year would be very much appreciated. I mean, we're surviving, but we're not. We're hanging on by a thread financially. I've been diving deeply into the Moodsville Prestige sub-label, and it's just really been the perfect backdrop for the holidays and for me in my headspace. By the way, someone asked me about my fingernails after my last episode on Coltrane and the free love movement, the socially conscious 60s global awakening, and he said some rather derogatory things about alternative lifestyles in the comments, and I of course deleted that stuff, but it came because I forgot to take my medication one day and I collapsed, and the EMT's like, why don't you paint one of your thumbnails? Like, I have a client who does that, and I did one, I didn't like it, so I did them all, and I kind of like it. It's kind of gothic and dark. But the irony of an episode about Coltrane's impact on the awakening and the global culture of the 60s, the counterculture, and to have someone making prejudice and ignorant, small-minded remarks on that episode. I mean, I'm a little surprised the guy even watched the channel, but he was worried I'd switch to the gay side with my black fingernails, and I mean, why is this guy even watching my channel? I mean, I'm probably challenging his conventions on a regular basis, and I mean, I don't like to delete comments no matter what their contents are, but I mean, there was just no real room to leave those ones up, and it was kind of sad. But so here we are, almost Christmas. Listen to a lot of Moodsville, and I've talked about Moodsville before, but it's an important little subset of the Prestige Jazz family. And as I've said before, Norman Granz at Verve really had a monopoly on most of the great black jazz musicians from the swing era. All the name brands, all the cats who were kind of iconic and the leaders of that instrument. The Coleman Hawkins, the Ben Websters, the Lester Youngs, the Billie Holidays, the Ella Fitzgeralds, the Charlie Parkers, the Johnny Hodges, the Count Basies. I mean, he had an incredible the Sweets Edisons, just an incredible stable of the elites, the Oscar Petersons, the Ray Browns. I mean, the list goes on and on. And most of the other labels that we kind of hold in high esteem today, Blue Note, Prestige, Riverside, I mean, Savoy to a lesser degree, we're using much more peripheral and a younger generation of players. And I've said it many times before, but the Blue Note roster of artists that we think of so highly today, I mean, those names were incredibly obscure in a national jazz landscape sense. Even the Sonny Rollinses and the Charlie Mingus's and the Thelonious Monks and the Miles Davises and the John Coltrane's, they weren't household names, Miles was getting there by 1959-60, of course. Coltrane's name was pretty big, but I mean, again, you read all the downbeat and Playboy jazz readers' polls of the great instruments in jazz. Those polls were dominated by all the great white imitators of the time, many of whom were great players, taking nothing away from Jerry Mulligan or Chet Baker, but these guys were winning all the Shorty Rogers, these guys were winning all the players' polls, and the black people, I mean, the distribution of the records alone and where the black musicians could play meant there was a great gulf in the white community's knowledge of the jazz innovators and who was cutting edge, and there was no internet, of course, for people to kind of Google or look up people's influences, you know, and where the music was really coming from. And it's amazing how many people who have come in the cafe this last year who were in the Army and the military in the 50s and the 60s, and they love jazz, but their knowledge of jazz is very limited to Woody Herman, Stan Kenton, and that era of white musicians that were playing, real players. But so there was a lot of obscure black artists who have become kind of household names today in the jazz community. Lee Morgan, Hank Mobley, I mean, there's Bill Evans. But in the broader sense, those guys were really off the map in 50s and 60s in terms of popularity and notoriety. But of that great tier of black musicians from the swing era, Norman Granz had most of them under contract. Ellington, of course, was at Columbia. He did some stuff for Norman, working with Armstrong and working with Hodges, but he was never like a full-fledged Verve recording artist. But once in a while, a guy would get out of his contract with Norman, or Norman didn't want to re-sign them for whatever reason, and they'd end up at Prestige. Bob Weinstock was only happy to sign a lot of those old cats. He knew that what they were going to do wasn't going to fit necessarily with the modern stuff happening on the 7000 series at Prestige. So he launches the Swingsville, Moodsville sequences, and one's just a little bit more up-tempo than the other. Very synonymous, really. Very similar artists on both. And gives them their own kind of sub-label to record at. And a lot of these guys are real legends of the 30s, 40s, and 50s that Weinstock's giving a tape to record. And I think these records were a little cheaper than the regular jazz Prestige albums. Not even positive on that, but if I remember, I've read that before, that the Moodsville was like 50 cents or $1 less than. But I remember even like a full-fledged, full-priced jazz record in those days was only $2-3, if I remember, in the 50s and 60s. So the gap couldn't have been too huge. But even if they were a budget label in terms of what they cost, there's no diminishing the quality of these recordings. The covers aren't always the best. Some of them are actually quite benign and almost boring, poor graphic design. It's not Reed Miles, honestly. But again, Blue Note didn't really do this. Blue Note has that stable of young kids doing, and by young kids, we're talking in their 30s and 40s. But, I mean, Dexter Gordon was an anomaly for Blue Note. Dexter was an older cat of a generation older than most of the Blue Note stable was. That, of course, came back from France, and I think he spent some time in jail, too. And Alfred Lion was just happy to sign Dexter. But for the most part, what Weinstock did here with these guys is of high, noteworthy praise. And some great stuff. Very good holiday jazz. And I want to just show you the sequence, because you should never pass up a Swingsville or Moodsville session. They're often underpriced because the covers aren't great. Some of the names are fairly obscure today. I mean, some of the Red Garland stuff will get up there because, of course, he worked with Miles, which gave him some notoriety. And I think they launched the series with a Red Garland session trio. Eddie Lockjaw Davis, Red Garland. Again, not the greatest cover. Charming in its own way. Sam Jones, Art Taylor, and Garland are the trio with Lockjaw sitting in. This is jazz that anybody can and will love. And I think that's the important thing to distinguish what we're talking about here. And I've listened to quite a few of these last few weeks. Volume 2 is Modern Moods with Miles Rollins, Jazz Quartet, Sonny Stitt. And it's just a compilation of ballads from some of their other recordings, which isn't very common for this series. Volume 3 is Red Alone, Red Garland. And they have the green label, sometimes like they're maroon if they're stereo, and just solo red. I'm a huge Red Garland fan, without any question. I love what he does. Volume 4 is Eddie Lockjaw Davis with Shirley Scott. Shirley's one of the great jazz organ players of the day. And Lockjaw, of course, is of Count Basie orchestra fame. One of the great soul, spiritual jazz players. And by spiritual, I'm not talking that kind of esoteric, almost pretentious spiritual jazz of the 60s and 70s. This was the spiritual jazz that's straight up black church. And Lockjaw is firmly in that. He's this real soul music in that sense. And we're not talking soul music of the R&B type. We're just talking the music that's laced with genuine expression. I'm a huge Lockjaw fan. Lockjaw Hairs with Shirley, George Duvivier, and Arthur Edgehill. Fantastic, great stuff. Volume 5, the Shirley Scott Trio. Volume 6, Red Garland Trio once again. So you see Red's already been featured quite a lot here. And these records can be found for a fairly good price. This has an alternate cover that fits that other sequence I'm showing you. This was a second cover at ease with Coleman Hawkins. So it's playing actually, a record I've featured many times on the channel. Just gorgeous playing by one of the great saxophonists of all time. Of course, Coleman is considered the guy who really pushed the saxophone where Armstrong took the trumpet, making an instrument that could be up front and lead and be very expressive and be the lead vocalist of the group, which saxophone before Coleman Hawkins never really filled that role. It was a backing, accompanying instrument, underutilized in classical music. It was a marching band instrument over in Europe. And to see Coleman's revolution, of course influenced by Armstrong when they played together with Fletcher Henderson. Frank West, I listened to this yesterday 3 times. Saxophonist, flautist, I think he played clarinet at times. Again, a Basieite. Just a fantastic guy who's very talented, very sensitive to playing what the piece calls for. Just a great lyricist in that emoting sense. Just wonderful, wonderful record. Tommy Flanagan, Eddie Jones, and Bobby Donaldson rounds us out. What a great session that you can find for probably $10-20. That's Volume 8. Volume 9, they gave Tommy Flanagan his own session. And Flanagan's body of work as a leader is really diminutive. For a great guy who's on hundreds of records as a sideman, who really kind of probably fit that role best, he didn't record a lot as a leader in this era. He does more so in the 70s and 80s, when he's become kind of a living legend almost by that time, and he's recording a lot for different labels in that era. But he doesn't record a lot as a leader here in the 50s and 60s, which is a little sad, but I mean, you find his work everywhere on the great labels in New York. Tommy Potterman and Roy Haynes is on this session. Listen to that 2 days ago. Again, 3 times through. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. The Moodsville stuff's a little bit more down-tempo to mid-tempo than the Swingsville stuff. Another Red Garland, Alone with the Blues. You don't see this record very often. I really enjoyed it. This is actually a status reissue of it, which was a kind of a definite budget label of prestige. Volume 11, the great Lem Winchester, a fantastic vibraphonist. Listened to this 2 days ago with Richard Wyans, George Duvivier, Roy Haynes. Just beautiful record. This is amazing. Coleman Hawkins here. Volume 12, the great Al Casey. Casey's a fantastic player on guitar. Had some fairly big contributions to jazz in the 40s. And again, kind of slips into obscurity as the 50s and 60s roll along. Belton Evans, Jimmy Lewis, and Lee Anderson. It's a fairly kind of obscure group today, but a record that's gorgeous that I actually think I'm going to play next. Huge fan of Al Casey. Number 13 is Oliver Nelson, the fantastic tenor player who this is a Nocturne with Lem Winchester. Oliver Nelson ends up becoming quite an arranger, first at Prestige, then eventually he goes to Verve working with Creed Taylor, and becomes more of an arranger producer than he does a player at some point. Ends up getting into television and then dies tragically in the early 70s. Richard Wines, George Duvivier, and Roy Haynes. So you're seeing a lot of the same rhythm sections. Wonderful, wonderful lyrical Oliver Nelson right there. Ballads by Arnett Cobb. Fantastic record. One of the great Texas tenormen. A beautiful, beautiful, thick tone. Willow Weep for me is just gorgeous. I played this record a lot over the years. And, I mean, these records are great holiday jazz records that your family is not going to be annoyed with you playing. Number 15 is Coleman Hawkins, The Hawk Relaxes. And Ron Albright, kind of an obscure piano player, who's really a brilliant player. Young Ron Carter, Kenny Burrell, and Andrew Cyril on the drums. Andrew Cyril, probably. Just a beautiful record. Again, these records, I don't need to keep describing them because they are in a vein. The great Billy Taylor interlude, number 16. Taylor, of course, has been around for quite a while now. He's recorded for a lot of labels, from Atlantic to Prestige to Riverside. Beautiful player. I think he's underappreciated today, honestly. I've had some people say he never really had his own style, but he could imitate anyone else's style. But I think Billy does have his own style. He's got a great percussive attack, really tactile player, very precise. I listened to this the other day probably 3 times. Willis Jackson, the great Florida Gator, as he was called, In My Solitude. Forget about it. It's just as beautiful as you're ever going to hear. Again, these records, they just call for multiple listens. And they're just such a good fucking headspace to be in. You're going to love everything on these labels. And your wife and your parents and your uncles and your aunts will all be like, wow, I never realized I like jazz this much. The great Gene Ammons, who obviously spent a lot of time in prison in the 60s. This was probably 1959. We're looking at here maybe 60. 61. Nice and cool. Gene Ammons with Doug Watkins, Richard Wines, and J.C. Hurd. So the talent level on these sessions is always just top of the mark. Beautiful lyrical playing. Shirley Scott gets another release here. Like Cozy, number 19. Number 20, Everything's Mellow, Clark Terry, the fantastic St. Louis trumpet player, who's one of the great kind of unheralded players of that era. Beautiful, lyrical, clean tone. It's very crisp. You know, it's a very crisp tone that Clark Terry has, very enunciated. Number 21, Mood Indigo. The great Taft Jordan plays Duke Ellington. One of the records I have 2 copies of. Probably could sell one of these, but Kenny Burrell, Richard Wines, Joe Benjamin, and Charlie Persett. Taft Jordan, again, I think he played with Ellington for quite a while, if I remember. Beautiful player on the trumpet. Yusuf Lateef, Eastern Sounds. This was also Prestige 7319, but it was issued first here as Moodsville 22. Interesting record. I listened to this the other day. Some interesting minimalist stuff. Yusuf has already been quite experimental, but he's also toning it down for this session to some degree, but it's still got Yusuf's trademark soundscapes at times. Coleman Hawkins played this the other day, good old Broadway. I mean, the legend himself, Bean, as he was known. Tommy Flanagan, Major Hawley, Eddie Locke. Just beautiful stuff. I played this the other day, probably 4 days ago, by great Sam the Man Taylor, another really forgotten player who his claim to fame is probably Harlem Nocturne, which it's just a gorgeous, haunting noir kind of melody, which he re-recorded several times over the years, and other people, of course, did it. And then Sam was, instead of going to Europe, he went to Japan and made himself a great life in Japan, and was very popular in Japan throughout the 60s and 70s, and just sadly became fairly forgotten here in America. But beautiful session. I loved a number of the tracks on here. The Bad and the Beautiful was beautiful. Anastasia, Songs of the Barefoot Contessa. Just, you gotta love Sam the Man Taylor. Again, just a forgotten guy. And Weinstock's giving these guys work, which is the bottom line, helping them pay their bills. Coleman Hawkins Quartet plays jazz version of No Strings. So Bean again here with Major Holly, Addie Locke, and Tommy Flanagan. I haven't played that one in a while, to be honest. Second Clark Terry plays the jazz version of All American. Arrangements by the great Oliver Nelson. Not my favorite Prestige cover, but Prestige manages to do that pretty frequently. The great Bud Johnson shows up on this. George Barrow on the baritone. Eddie Costa, Art Davis, Ed Shaughnessy. A bit of a bigger session, bigger arrangements, which Clark Terry was one of his signature things. Solid trumpeter Cootie Williams. And Cootie doesn't get a lot of stuff as a leader. Fantastic player, played with Ellington. A guy that deserves much more credit than he gets. The Soulful Moods of Gene Ammons. Again, not a great cover, but these records are all wonderful, wonderful records to play. One of the more expensive Moodsville number 29 here is Kenny Burrell with Coleman Hawkins featuring a new bossa nova, probably from 62, maybe 3. Once you get into the bossa nova, you're talking 62, 63. Burrell's is a beautiful player of the highest regard, and his name drives the price of that one up quite a bit. Misty, Eddie Lockjaw Davis with Shirley Scott, and those two played together quite a lot over the years. Misty's a great song. Richard Groove Holmes, of course, kind of brought that song to the people, along with, I think, Aaron Garner was one of the first real big hits with it. But Coleman Hawkins plays Make Someone Happy from Do Re Mi. Again, there's Mr. Bean in the jazz world, Coleman Hawkins. Wouldn't It Be Lovely, Out of My Dreams. Just wonderful Broadway renditions. And I think on some level, what Weinstock realizes is that Norman Granz has tapped into something. He's given these guys sessions of tunes from the show tunes that White America was buying. White America bought Norman Granz's Jazz at the Philharmonic and those great sessions he was doing with Ella and Billy. And Norman was really having success, making money, and having his records distributed nationally. So the success of Norman Granz with these players, I'm sure, is a big part of why Weinstock said, you know what, let's sign whatever guys we can on the periphery of that and do stuff from the Broadway show tunes that White America will buy. And these records probably sold pretty well for Prestige. And Prestige, of course, never had the distribution that Verve had. But, and that's important to understand, is the distribution channels. Once you start distributing nationally, it changes your sales volumes dramatically. And most of these small historical jazz labels never had national distribution. And especially the Black Race Record, Black Neighborhood labels, those labels were never intended to be distributed nationally. Miles Davis and John Coltrane played Richard Rodgers, Moodsville 32. And this is stuff taken from the Cooking, Working, Steaming, Relaxing earlier stuff that they're repackaging for this Moodsville sequence. And as you get into the 30s now, you start getting a bit more of a hodgepodge of stuff. Dave Pike plays the jazz version of Oliver. Not a great cover once again. Probably 63. The great Jimmy Rainey's on the guitar here, Tommy Flanagan. Walter Perkins on the drums, and George Tucker. Pike was a fantastic vibraphonist, and some of his records go for pretty good money, to be honest. Number 38, the Broadway scene, played by America's Greatest Jazzmen, Hawkins, Willis Jackson, Flanagan. This is probably a compilation, but so it's really 1 through about 30 that you really want to seek after. Although this one's fantastic. Lucky Thompson plays Jerome Kern, who was with number 39. And so that's the Moodsville set series that I've collected. I think I have most everything. I think they omitted a few numbers in the 30s there. But it's a really great session of records. Recorded through a small window, probably 59-60 through maybe 63, 64. And then Prestige kind of lumps everything back into the soul jazz, into the 7,000 sequence at that point. And they're really kind of focused on the organ, guitar, saxophone, soul jazz of the 60s, late 60s into the 70s at that point. And so the new jazz sequence, Swingsville and Moodsville, those sequences all come to an end. And it all just ends up back in the 7,000 sequence at Prestige. But Weinstock, although not the greatest human being, but none of us are, we're all flawed in our ways, he still is a very valuable contributor to the legacy and the documentation of a lot of these men's lives, and women too. And the Moodsville series of records is not something you should ever overlook. Don't ever pass them up. And if you see one for 10, 15, 20 bucks, just don't hesitate. Don't hesitate. I promise you, you'll enjoy it. And some of the things that we think that we love so much, you will tire of. You won't want to hear some of those records every day for the rest of your life. These are the kind of records you can play anytime. They'll never be boring. They'll never be, oh, I'm not in the mood for this. They'll never be squinty and squeaky. They're always going to be beautiful, but genuinely soulful, honest, integral expressions of these men and women's lives and their stories and their narrations and the history of this country. It's important stuff. And it doesn't receive the notoriety and the fame, and the records don't go for hundreds of dollars, if not thousands. And so no one seems to value jazz in that vein. But let me tell you, jazz in the budget lane can be some of the best jazz you'll ever buy. And a record you spend $300 for that you listen to 10 times over the rest of your life, it's an expensive record. A record you spend 10 bucks for and listen to 30 times, you're getting your money's worth. And I know a lot of people, well, I'm always going to want to listen to the avant-garde, but trust me, I've been listening to jazz a long time. You will not want to always hear difficult, squeaky, honky, shredding, difficult shit. You won't. And you'll spend a lot of time listening to that shit alone if you do. There's a time and a place for that. But there's also a time and a place for this. And don't get me wrong, I'll still put on a squeaky, difficult session at times when it fits my mood. But again, for every ounce of my being, music needs to be the backdrop, the soundtrack to your life and your moments in your existence. And do you want to live in a tense, difficult place at all times and moments? Or do you want some serenity? Do you want some moments of pastoral elegance and grace? Do you want to sit back and kick your feet up and just absorb a little bourbon, some scotch, a hot chocolate if you're sober like I am at this point? Sadly, the only two things I really drink at this point are coffee and water. I'm pretty much cut out juice. I don't drink alcohol. I don't ever touch soda. I mean, it's pretty much water and coffee for me at this point in my life. But that's partly why I've lost over 60 pounds. Like, I'm down to 190 in there, 185. I'm somewhere in there. I haven't weighed myself in a couple of weeks. But eating healthy is important at this age in life. I want to wish everyone a merry, happy Christmas, happy holidays, how you want to refer to that. I mean, I'm not too concerned about how you like to name your holidays. If you want to call it Christmas, you want to call it a holiday, it's all good by me. But just stay with love in your heart. Value this music because it is an important part of our story and our history and our narrative. I appreciate all of everyone's support through this year. This channel's been a great place for me to find comfort through a tough storm. I feel like I'm coming out the other side. I can see land, ahoy. There's a shore to be seen. I'm swimming there. I'm getting there. getting my strength. I'm getting my freedom, my independence. The few times I've seen my wife the last 4 months have been hard. She's not the person I once knew, and it kills my joy for a few days when I see her. It takes me a while to get kind of back up on my feet, because it's no longer even that yearning or that longing to be with her. It's just seeing how hard the choices she's made have been on her, and her pride and her stubborn and determination to kind of live with her choices. I know she's hurting, and I just pray to the cosmos that she gets the help that she needs to get back on her feet. She's done a lot of good for a lot of people over the years, and my heart is with her. My heart's with her kids as well. I know this has been tough on them. Y'all be blessed. Y'all be safe. Stay strong. Please keep helping to support the channel and this cafe. This is an important place, and the revenues are what they are. I'm in a small town in rural Trump America, and I don't get the local support I need. So most of my support comes from the surrounding region and surrounding states, and even across the country I get people. But that stuff's all intermittent, and we're doing what we can. We're surviving, but I mean, these next few months are probably going to be pretty thin, being January, February, which are tough for everyone. So if you want to support this place, please make a donation to the channel. It would be appreciated. I hate having to ask for money. It's not something I enjoy doing. I hate having to sell or market myself. It's not my strong suit. Even as a DJ, I always undersold my wares. And hopefully I'll find someone to move in here with me eventually that will help make my finances far more secure. But I can't rush that either, because that's also asking for trouble. Love you all. Be safe. Happy holidays. Peace.